Mr. Speaker, today's rule, as you've heard, provides for the consideration of 3 partisan appropriation bills. And while I certainly agree with my colleague from Georgia regarding the myriad of threats posed to our country, these bills fall far short of addressing those threats. House Republicans have regrettably kicked off the appropriations season by doubling down on failed legislation that would, in effect, harm our service members, abandon our allies, cede the UN to our adversaries, and withhold critical resources needed to secure our southern border. When it comes to global leadership and national security, House Democrats and House Republicans have a very different approach. House Republicans' Department of State, Foreign Ops, and Related Programs Appropriations Act, H.R. 8771, ultimately revives the doomed isolationism of the early 20th century. Across the globe, America's adversaries threaten the peace and the prosperity of the free world. With wars in the Middle East and Europe, humanitarian crises on nearly every continent, the world needs American leadership. How do House Republicans respond? By introducing a bill that cuts international disaster assistance programs by $1.3 billion, cuts international financial institutions by $583 million, cuts $362 million from programs to improve maternal and child health and fight infectious diseases. By cutting funding, ultimately, for the United Nations and other multilateral investments, this bill is a reversal of our country's historic position among the nations where we stand as a beacon for democracy and liberty. Then we have H.R. 8752, the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act of 2025. Now, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle claim that this bill will secure our border. It will not. The bill falls short of our responsibility to provide for the safety and security of Americans. Ultimately, it disinvests, decreases funding for a variety of critical programs designed to prevent threats from terrorists, transnational criminals, foreign adversaries, and violent extremists. My colleagues, Mr. Speaker, do not want to secure the border. How do we know? Because they had a chance to do precisely that just a few short months ago. They had a chance to do that with the Senate's bipartisan border plan. What did House Republicans do instead? They ensured that that bipartisan deal never even received a vote at the behest of their leader, former President Trump. The proposal under consideration this week that Republicans have put on the floor cuts the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office by $48 million. It cuts the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center by $10.4 million. Ask yourself, Mr. Speaker, why would House Republicans put a bill on the floor that cuts federal law enforcement training programs? It's a fair question. The bill includes no funds for targeted violence and terrorism prevention grants and the Shelter and Services Program. It cuts family reunification efforts by $33.9 million. At bottom, Mr. Speaker, this is another wasted opportunity, in my view, for House Republicans to address what they say is a top priority: border security. Finally, the rule includes H.R. 8774, the Department of Defense Appropriations Act. This bill is extreme even by House Republican standards. Usually, in my experience, it's been the Rules Committee that has been responsible for, well, for lack of a better phrase, messing up these massive bipartisan efforts, at least during the 118th Congress under Republican control. But my colleagues in the majority on the Rules Committee didn't even get the opportunity to do that with respect to this bill because it came out of committee as a terrible piece of legislation. It divides the country. It undermines national security. It includes provisions that fail to support service personnel. The bill cuts civilian positions at a time when the department is struggling to meet readiness goals. A number of extreme policy riders that have been included within the bill, targeting reproductive care of women, the LGBTQ community, and more. And finally, it fails to invest in a number of different important programs critical to our national security. It is a bill, unfortunately, detached from reality. And, of course, the elephant in the room, what we all know to be true, it has no chance of becoming law. Let me repeat that, Mr. Speaker. This bill that we're considering today, all three, have no chance of becoming law. The rest of this is theater. And what I would implore my colleagues to do is come back to the negotiating table. Let's negotiate and compromise in good faith. Abandon this approach that they have unfortunately taken for the better part of the last 19 months in the 118th Congress, which has ultimately led to this Congress being the least productive in 100 years in the history of this House. Let's pursue solutions, not stunts. I would encourage my colleagues to perhaps follow that admonition. I suspect they won't, but hope springs eternal that they'll get back to working with us so that we can get back to governing. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the